All right. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
It's the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
I would like to welcome you all to Second Mott and to this week's reading and discussion on Little Essays Toward Truth. We are now on the essay Indifference. So if you are not a member of Second Mott, we would genuinely appreciate $5 or $10 or, whatever's in your bank account that you feel like handing over to help support our activities and spread more thelema to more people. Oops, click. There we go. All right, this is the obligatory warning slide. Your mileage may vary considerably. I am not an expert, except when I am an expert. Slippery when wet, science is real, wash your hands, wear a mask. The Little Essays Toward Truth, for those of you who haven't been with us, and for those of you who need a refresher, because we're only going through one essay a month, these are 16 essays that Aleister Crowley wrote on concepts fundamental to human existence in light of the Kabbalah. Crowley considered the Kabbalah's ground plan the most precious jewel of human thought and the most convenient method for classifying the phenomena of the universe. In fact, Crowley was of the opinion that everything whatsoever can be applied to the tree of life and organized that way in interconnected knowledge within your mind. He considered Little Essays to be a species of commentary on the Chaldean oracles, which are a collection of precepts attributed to Zoroaster, who may or may not have been one person or a group of people or anybody at all, that were collected up by a Byzantine philosopher in the 11th century. So this week, I thought we'd try something a little bit different, changing up how I usually format the class. So if you've watched the videos or been to class in the past, we're going to do something different because the theme is indifference. So I thought I'd throw in some difference. Har, har, har. I'll be here for the next hour and a half. All right. These essays were first published in 1938. And Vanessa, can I have you start off reading for us, please?
Sure. The state of mind which is characterized by indifference is commonly called trance, but the monsieur is unfortunate. Is that how misnomer? Okay,
yes.
Sorry. The misnomer is unfortunate. It is, in fact, a sense the precise contrary of a trance. For trance usually implies samadhi, and this state specifically excludes any such occurrence. That implies a uniting. And this a will disassociation. Yet there is nothing herein to suggest necessarily any practice of the Black Brothers, for it is not, properly speaking, an attainment, but rather a convenient attitude, and it is one of the very greatest practical importance and use. One cannot remain indefinitely in any samadhi. At the same time, it is proper to fill the intervals between guts of positive work in such a way as to leave oneself as free as possible to take this next step. One should therefore cultivate a habit of mind which is not bound by any form of desire. The state of indifference is thus a form of that silence which is definiteness and protection, and is cognate with the third noble truth of Buddhism, sorrows ceasing.
Nick, please.
The general idea of the state is that the mind should react automatically to each and every impression. It does not matter whether the event be A or nay. Blavatsky observes that the feeling is at least tinged with disgust, but this is an error. Such a state is imperfect. There should, on the contrary, be a quite definite joy, not in the impression itself, but in being indifferent to it. This joy springs doubtless from the sense of power involved, but that is again an imperfection. One should rather rejoice in the cognizance of the ultimate truth that existence is pure joy, not in any feeling more immediate.
Jeff? Wendy?
It is to be observed that the attainment and maintenance of this state depends to a great extent on the mastery of several trances. For instance, one must be convinced of the first noble truth by the trance of sorrow, or it would not be logical to be indifferent to all things. There might be, in the absence of this perception of sabi pi dukam, some impression which actually led to some state free of sorrow, and this is not the case. Freedom from sorrow depends on freedom from impression.
Jeff?
I actually muted myself. Okay, can you hear me?
Awesome. I can.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you. Take this one.
Yes. Yet it would not be fair to say that this state of indifference was akin to the dullness which succeeds the acute spasm of sorrow. It is not the anesthesia of a nerve worn out by an excessive pain. There is never any place in the curriculum of a magician for passivity. Of course, we here accept that what may be called the active or willed passivity described in Liber 15. Indifference is to be an intensely active condition. One may compare it with the ease of a skilled fencer who meets and deflects every possible attack of his antagonist with equal vigor, unconscious of his acts, because he has trained his eye, wrist, and even his blade to think for themselves. Thus, indifference is the spiritual form of automatic consciousness of the adept, and this resides in YESOD, the place of the fortress on the frontier of the abyss, as described in Liber 418 in the 11th Aether.
Vanessa?
This indifference being a habit of normal mind, it is easier to attain than any true samadhic state, and it involves less technical ability. This is particularly the case because, as noted above, the trance of sorrow has been an almost necessary preliminary to the proper understanding of what it implies. The method, therefore, of acquiring, the word to be preferred to attaining, indifference is simple. It is, in effect, the way of the Tao.
Nick?
The following sororities may prove useful to the aspirant. Existence is only to be understood as a continuum. All parts of existence are therefore ultimately equivalent, each being equally necessary to complete the whole. Each event is thus to be received with equal honor, and the reaction to it made with equal indifference.
Wendy?
To offer a practical parallel, suppose one is to receive £1,000 and this amount is paid over in diverse coins with IOUs for various sums. Since one knows in advance that the balance in one's favor is £1,000, one does not get excited on the appearance of any particular item, but goes on steadily counting, making the right reaction, whether a plus or a minus item is at issue, with perfect calm and accuracy. Each entry in the account may be different, but one's mental attitude is invariable. The common error of the unphilosophical mind is indeed due to ignorance of the true nature of the soul. One is apt to suppose that each event as it occurs may be good or bad, may indicate that one is winning or losing. But as soon as one is certain that the issue is factitious, that it has been determined beforehand, it becomes absurd to be affected by one incident in the illusory process which nature uses symbolically to express the faculty of truth rather than by any other.
Jeff?
It is interesting to note that this method of acquiring indifference is quite independent of any experience of the trance of sorrow. It is a simple and normal consideration based on strictly thelemic premises. It is thus most highly to be recommended. The methods of the dead Aeon of Horus were in fact attended with no inconsiderable danger. The question of separateness from the universe is critical, for one thing. For another, it is a mistake to be dependent on such a theory as that implied in the First Noble Truth in its outer aspects. It is altogether better to adopt the purely intellectual attitude and anchor it subsequently in the Shakma by simply transcending the normal rational mind in the usual way by the method of contradiction, or equating the opposites, such as described in Noxopox, yep, can never pronounce it, and in the best essays on the Holy Kabbalah.
Vanessa?
It is apt, moreover, to lead to several types of error to regard indifference as a state inferior to samadhi. In particular, one may tend to think of it as a passive, as imperfect, as an integram, whereas it should be considered as a state of peace with victory.
Nick?
It need only be added in conclusion that indifference is not perfect until it has entered into full possession of at least one samadhic trait, automatism. As long as there remains any need of conscious effort in dealing with any impression, any need to remember the process by which the state is reached, or even any need of conscious interference with or cognizance of the purely spontaneous elastic reflex reaction, the aspirant to the summum bonum, true wisdom and perfect happiness, has not adequately acquired the habit of indifference.
Okay, so what just happened? Ordinarily, I start off with a whole bunch of information and chop the essay up into little pieces with other things I've discovered in my studies. And I thought that perhaps this week I'd try front-loading the entire essay so everyone has at least a little bit of personal experience with the essay before I proceed to chop it into itty-bitty little pieces. So to start out with, indifference has a number of definitions, and let's go back. Those of you that know me well know that I have an ongoing love affair with the Oxford English Dictionary, so that was my consulted work here. Indifference can be the making of no difference between conflicting parties, or impartiality. And by the way, one of the reasons I like to go through the definition is to consider what other words Crowley might have chosen instead of indifference. So there are a lot of, as we go through the definitions, you'll see there are a lot of potential cognates, but Crowley chose indifference for a particular reason. Anyway, we'll see if someone can figure that out, because I didn't. Number 2, absence of feeling for or against. Hence, especially, absence of care for or about a person or thing. Want of zeal, interest, concern, or attention. Unconcern or apathy. 3a, indetermination of the will or of a body to rest or motion. Neutrality. B, in psychology, the indifference point is the position or value between two continua of experience, such as a temperature that is experienced as neither warm nor cold, or a feeling value that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. 4a, the quality of being indifferent, or neither decidedly good nor evil. Or B, passableness, mediocrity, as indifference of quality. Number 5, want of difference or distinction between things. Number 6, the fact of not mattering or making no difference. Unimportance, especially phrased as a matter of indifference. Also an instance of this, a thing or matter of no essential importance. Number 7, specific to the concept of magnetism, the indifference point or point of indifference is the middle zone where the attractive powers of two ends neutralize each other. In economics, which I know is everyone's favorite, the indifference curve or line of indifference is a graph, the coordinates of which are the qualities of alternate goods and services that would leave the consumer indifferent in choosing between them because he judges them of equal value, also known as the indifference map. So if you see 3 different brands of aspirin on the shelf and they're all aspirin and they're all the same, like it doesn't really make much difference to you which one you pick. So indifference, ordinarily, my next step would be to go look up whatever the theme du jour of Crowley's essay was in the Darby Bible, which is what he had to read growing up. And then I would turn to the holy books of Thelema. However, indifference as a word does not crop up in any of these places. And this is the first of the words that Crowley has chosen as his titles that does not so appear. So I thought about, well, there's difference, but how about difference instead of indifference? And there are 2 verses of the Book of the Law that use the word difference. The first is in the 1st chapter, verse 4, every number is infinite, there is no difference. Later on in verse 22 of the same chapter, since I am infinite space and the infinite stars thereof, do ye also thus, bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby cometh hurt. Now, it is not my job to interpret the Book of the Law for you, and I will not do so. However, I will quote a few pillars of pestilence just to jog your thoughts on difference and indifference. One said that every man and every woman is not only a part of God, but the ultimate God. Thus, make no difference between every number is infinite, right? Make no difference. Each one of us is the one God, capital letters. This can only be understood by the initiate one must acquire certain higher states of consciousness to appreciate it. In further commentary, there may be some who are still unaware of the fact, but the mathematical and physical sciences are in no sense concerned with absolute truth, but only the relations between observed phenomena and the observer. And Jeff, since that's pooping on math, I thought of you as I was typing out that quote. Just a few more. Crowley's official commentary on the equinox was that these verses are a charge to destroy the faculty of discriminating between illusions. And so in the concept of indifference, if you are making no difference between one thing and any other thing, you are destroying the faculty of discriminating between things that you can see here on this plane, which we know to be illusions. I liked this last comment quite a bit. To make no difference, as ordained, is to regard the whole of the non-ego or universe apparently external to the self as a single phenomenon. Samadhi on any one thing becomes therefore samadhi on the whole. The mystic who availeth in this can then perform his great work of love under will in a single operation, instead of being obliged to unite himself with the non-ego piecemeal. And since I'm a word nerd, the final bit of this really struck with me. He said, notice the word of hurt. It comes from the French word heurter, which literally means to knock against an obstacle. So make no difference between one thing and any other, for thereby cometh knocking your head against an obstacle. We won't discuss that further because everyone's mileage may vary. So going back to Crowley's words, I've made Crowley an owl sitting on top of books this week. So when that icon appears, they're all Crowley words, not mine. But there are a number of concepts in this initial paragraph about indifference that bear a little bit of further digging. The first is trance, which is something that we've seen before, the concept of samadhi, and then the noble truths of Buddhism. So let's unpack those. Crowley defines a trance as implying a passing beyond, and specifically passing beyond the conditions that oppress. And you can think of this as the trances that Crowley describes, and they're described in occult literature as spiritual experiences, are all passing beyond some condition or something or some obstacle that is preventing you from developing further spiritually or moving up the tree of life, if you would like to think of it that way. So the origin literally comes from a word that means to go across, changed into Old French, to depart, to fall into trance, then came into Middle English to be in a trance, and hence our word trance. So the trance of something generally implies, or as Crowley uses the term, generally describes what it is the trance is helping you to move beyond. Now, samadhi is used in both Hinduism and Buddhism, and Crowley was thoroughly steeped in Buddhism and was, in fact, a practicing Buddhist when he received the Book of the Law. So the concept of samadhi or samadhi is a state of intense concentration that is achieved through meditation. And in Patanjali's yoga, which is what you think of when he wrote the Yoga Sutras, so when you think of Raja Yoga or of classical Ashtanga yoga, 8-limb yoga, samadhi is the 8th limb. It's that final stage where you've essentially reached enlightenment before or at death. Now, Crowley makes several references to the noble truths of Buddhism in this essay, and he specifically focuses on 1 and 3. But we've discussed all of these pretty much previously in relationship to Crowley's other essays. And I was joking earlier that after every session, your homework should be to go reread every other essay and see how all of those essays relate to the one that we're discussing now, because I don't know what order Crowley wrote them in, but they're all interdependent in their concepts. So the truth of suffering is everything is, you have this perception that everything is separate, right? It's the illusion that you are disconnected from God, that individual things are separate from you and people are separate from you. And the truth of the cause of that suffering is people wanting stuff, right? This is desire and attachment. But I don't want to grow old. I like my hair the color it is, but I don't want to, change jobs. I don't want to whatever. And that is the cause of the suffering. The truth of the end of suffering is raised in this essay as the realization that suffering is optional if you don't make that difference between different things, if you don't have a different reaction, if you can maintain that point of indifference. In Buddhism, the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering, and that is the Buddhist Eightfold Path, which isn't terribly relevant to our work here, but if you are interested, taking a look at it may help you to understand a little bit more about how Crowley was thinking and the early development of his concept of philema. So the Four Noble Truths are the essence of the Buddhist teaching. They are noble, or referred to as noble, because they liberate individuals from suffering if they accept those four truths. And they form the core of Buddhist practice. So moving on to the next section, Crowley explains a little bit about what he means by indifference. The state of mind should be the same to each and every impression. I got chocolate, yay. I got vanilla, yay. I got strawberry, yay. I got pistachio, yay. Now, in reality, we all have preferences, and if you gave me pistachio ice cream, I probably would be kind of sad unless that was the only ice cream on offer. So I'm going to have some kind of reaction, right? That's natural to being human. Crowley talks about Blavatsky. It's kind of useful to know who she is, so we'll talk about that for a little bit. And it's notable here because Crowley is saying Blavatsky is wrong, which he does with great frequency. And Blavatsky's observation is, a reaction is kind of a little bit of disgust to something. And Crowley further explains in this paragraph that, well, having a reaction of disgust is not being indifferent, right? If you're indifferent to something and you're not allowing it to knock you off of your balance or your equanimity, it doesn't matter whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. You're not going to be disgusted by it. You're not going to have any reaction to it at all. You'll maintain that calm, balanced point. And in fact, Crowley then goes on to refer to the Book of the Law when he says, look, it's an imperfection to say, oh yeah, well, I'm a little bit disgusted by that, because your joy should be in the ultimate truth that existence is pure joy. And if existence is pure joy and every single thing you experience is part of existence, it's all pure joy. Questions, comments, or read remarks so far? All right, hearing none. A few quick words about Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She's a very colorful character, to say the least. She is described as a controversial Russian occultist, philosopher, and author by Wikipedia. She co-founded the Theosophical Society, which is recognized or has been described by scholars as kind of a mashup of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. But Blavatsky referred to it as the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. And if this sounds a lot to you like the method of science, the aim of religion, you wouldn't be too far off. And there's the quote, of course, from the Book of the Law, remember ye that all existence is pure joy, that all the sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done, but there is that which remains. So in terms of indifference and reactions and sorrows and the Four Noble Truths, there's something to go meditate on later on. All right, so Crowley continues with this essay saying that the attainment and maintenance of this state, by which he means indifference, depends to a great extent on the mastery of several trances. And little footnote there, mastery is the next essay, and that's the one we're doing in November. So come on back and we'll talk about mastery. So he goes on to give an example, right? If we're going to attain and maintain this state of indifference, we have to first be convinced of the first noble truth through the trance of sorrow, or it wouldn't make any sense for us to, be indifferent to things, right? If everything is, if in some sense things are different for reals, then being indifferent doesn't make sense. But if you accept the truth that everything that we view and see and experience on this plane and the physical universe that we are in is an illusion to some extent. It is the manifestation of, God, the universe, infinite, insert your favorite word here, turned into our little meat suits and the things that we can touch and play with and think, versus the actual God, the universe, the most holy, the everything. So again, Four Noble Truths. So the first one is the truth of suffering. Everything is suffering, basically. Now, the trance of sorrow takes a special place. Oops, go backwards. Takes a special place in Crowley world and in these essays, because in these essays, remember, Crowley's commenting on the Kabbalah and on 16 concepts that make up the heart of man, as it were, or the existence of being an embodied human. And the trance of sorrow is the motivation for all spiritual development in Crowley's eyes. In the very first essay on man, Crowley writes that what then determines Tiferath, the human will, to aspire to comprehend neshama, to submit itself to the divine will of Chia? And this is the question of you, the person living on this planet right now, standing in the center of the tree of life at the Tiferath Sephiroth, right? That's the human will. What makes you standing there in Tiferath want to go anywhere? Like, Tiferath is glory and sun and the rosy cross and all the positive things. Like, why not just hang out? And the answer for Crowley is that nothing but the realization, sooner or later, born of agonizing experience, that your whole relationship to the universe is only painful because it's all an illusion. And when you die, it's all going away. When you leave this existence, none of this is real anymore. So your human will says, gosh, this makes no sense at all. I've got to find some way to make sense of the universe. And the way that you make sense of the universe is to want to understand what it is that is behind the universe, right? What is that God / capital U universe / great spirit, whatever you want to call it, above there. And so it is this trance of sorrow, the realization that, gosh, everything here is an illusion, that is what drives the individual to evolve spiritually. So here's a tiny little refresher. Some of you have seen this slide before. This is probably the world's worst tree of life, and I didn't draw it, so don't complain about the missing paths or the fact that everything is spelled funny or that it's pixelized. Sorry, guys. I'll do better next time. But this is what determines Tiferath right here in the center. What tells it wants to aspire to comprehend neshama up here across the veil of the abyss, and to submit itself to the divine will of Chia over here in Hokmah, eventually moving up to Cather, that God spark and union with divinity. And it is the trance of sorrow. All right. Crowley refers to SAMADHI Dukam, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but that's okay. It's a Buddhist concept. Remember, in this essay, he said, in the absence of some perception of this, everything is sorrow, right? Some impression might lead you to think, oh, hey, there's a place where I can be free of sorrow. But if you understand that everything is sorrow, then you won't have that misconception that, well, if I just have chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla, I'll be happy or spiritually fulfilled. So remember, Buddhism considers all things sorrow, even those that men find joyful. This isn't really a paradox because all reactions that produce consciousness or disturb consciousness are ultimately sorrowful. They're disturbances of the perfection of peace and obstructions to the flow of your energy. So the one great sorrow is embodiment, because it requires separation of the little God spark that is you from the big God that is everything, that is the unity of all that is and was and is to come. Crowley also wrote a poem with this title, SAMADHI Dukam, Everything is Sorrow, that if you were interested, I can send to you later. So before we move on, anyone have any thoughts they'd like to share? Insights, disagreements, think I'm full of crap? All right. So in the next section, Crowley tries to explain a little bit more about what indifference is by saying what it's not. So he says it's not the dullness that exceeds the acute spasm of sorrow. Like everything is horrible and I'm just going to be sad about it. And I like his example. It's not the anesthesia of a nerve worn out by excess of pain, right? If you have something that's poking that nerve constantly, eventually you stop feeling the pain because the signal's always on and you're like, that's just how it is. But Crowley mentions two things that essentially are going to be homework for you because they can each be their own class. One is there's no room for passivity except for active, capital A, or willed, capital W, passivity as described in Liber 65. And the other is he refers to indifference as the spiritual form of the automatic consciousness of the adept, and says that resides in Yesod and makes a reference to the vision and the voice. So you can go do your own reading of Liber 65, because this is a lot of stuff, but here's the quote originally, right? There's never any place in the curriculum of magician for passivity. This is also known as Liber Cordis Sancti Serpente, or the Book of the Heart Girt with a Serpent. This is a publication in Class A that Crowley received during the end of October, beginning of November in 1907. And he describes it as an account of the relations of the aspirant, that's you, with his holy guardian angel. Crowley also commented that the full knowledge and interpretation of this book is concealed from all, save only the shining triangle. I haven't really figured out what he means by that, but maybe you have. It's one of the bits of homework that is given to people who are working through the AA curriculum, and they are expected to memorize an entire chapter. And this is quite a fat little book. So to tease out what constitutes commentary on active or willed passivity is quite a bit of a task. I did not think it appropriate to try to recap that and jam it into our short time together today. So go for it. The second part is a reference to Liber 418, also known as the vision and the voice. Crowley refers to the state of indifference as belonging to Yesod, the palace of the fortress on the frontier of the abyss, all caps, as described in Liber 418 in the 11th Aether. And so also the 11th Aether is beyond the scope of this class, but I teased out just a few little things I thought you might find interesting. There's a quote where he's describing what he's seeing. He says, "Yet they, which they are a giant army of angels, are not resting upon their arms, but tense and vigilant. And between them and me is the god Shu, whom before I did not see, because his force filleth the whole aether." And there's a footnote in the vision and the voice that explains that Shu is in Yesod as the supporter of the tree of life, and he is Zeus, the lord of air. But he is also Zeus, the orderer of all things. There's one description of the fortress itself. Specifically, it says, "I perceive that all this army is defended by fortresses, 9 mighty towers of iron upon the frontier of the aether. Each tower is filled with warriors in silver armor." Ignore the number 5. "It is impossible to describe the feeling of tension. They are like oarsmen waiting for the gun, like sitting in the boat waiting for the race to start. We're about to go." And the 9 towers are footnoted as a reference to Yesod because Yesod is Sephiroth number 9. It's also referred to as foundation. And remember, this is the Sephiroth where the vision of the machinery of the universe, or how things actually work, happens, and where the vision of change happens, and also where in Crowley's 5 parts of the soul of man, the nephesh, or the animal soul, or kind of like instinct and hindbrain sort of part of you live. So a quick note about Yesod, which is only orange because that's the color that the computer selected for me, and I could not figure out how to change it. Crowley refers to this indifference as the spiritual form of automatic consciousness of the adept, and this resides in Yesod. The 9th path, as described by the Sefer Yetzirah, is called the pure intelligence because it purifies the emanations. Now think about this in the concept of indifference. It proves and corrects the designing of their representation and disposes the unity with which they are designed without diminution or division. Yesod's virtue is independence, and you can think of, I thought of independence and how it goes with indifference, right? In being the prefix that means not. So indifference is not different, and independence is not dependent. So when you hit that point where you're indifferent, where you recognize, oh, all of these things around me are illusions, and I can react, or I can choose to be non-reactive to each of them in exactly the same way, you've also, in a way, gained your independence from being controlled by forces outside of you. Your mileage may vary. The vice is idleness. Oh, none of these things affect me, so I can just hang out. Yesod is also known as the treasure house of images, in part because it contains all of the potential pictures of things to be. And the symbols are the perfume and sandals. Now, in addition to the machinery of the universe, Yesod is associated with the framework on which the dense matter of Malkuth is going to hang. So if you think about things going from a spark of spirit down to the meat suit that hangs out in Malkuth, this is like where the skeleton and the sinews live. Like all the pieces aren't quite there yet, but this is the structure, or like the frame of a building without any of the parts that actually make it a building attached to it. And because I can't stop myself and slides are always best in threes, because Yesod holds the image of everything that exists in the world, that's where Treasure House of Images comes from. Yesod is also recognized as the moon, as the reflector of the sun's light. And if you look over at the Tree of Life, and you can see this little orange spot here that represents Yesod, if you go up one, that's Tiferath, straight up the middle. This next dot up would be Doth, which isn't really a Sephiroth, but again, I didn't draw this Tree of Life, so ignore that for a moment. And then at the top here, we have Kether. And if you think about Tiferath in the center as the sun, or as a reflection of Kether in an embodied sort of form, right? The moon is in many ways a reflection of the sun, because the moon doesn't give off its own light, right? So we have that lunar and solar going on here in the center of our tree, between the meatiest of the meat suit and the airy, fairiest of the spiritual substance. So Yesod is also associated with the Archangel of the Annunciation, the one that said, "Psst, Mary, you're going to have a kid." And that's the Archangel Gabriel. And Archangel Gabriel is known with giving the power of vision, or the power to see. And remember, we're talking about indifference. And the reason you need to be indifferent is because finally you see that the truth is all of these different things that you perceive as separate or you perceive as real are neither separate nor real. So you have a true vision of what lies above the abyss, which conveniently is the black line on this slide, and what is the true reality of the universe. So there are other classical foundations of the universe. If you think of Yesod as being the framework or as holding up the world, Atlas is a myth of a man holding up the world, right? There are also myths from other cultures that talk about an elephant, a tortoise, or an eagle holding up the world or being the foundation for the world. And while Yesod is lunar, and you might think of these as lunar creatures to the extent that they're holding up this foundation, they're a reflection of the four holy living creatures of Kether that are also reflected in the sun, which are the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the man. And those four symbols are also associated with many, many other things that come in fours, like, I don't know, elements, directions, fancy angels, other stuff like that. Finally, I thought that the idea of sandals and perfume were both really interesting as symbols for something that is lunar and is so far down the tree of life, so far down towards Malkuth on this Kabbalistic diagram. And Gareth Knight's book says that sandals tie Yesod to Hod, which is the first sphere on the pillar on the left, right? And Hod is number 8, splendor, and Yesod is number 9, foundation. So moving from 9 to 8, the sandals are relevant because this path between Yesod and Hod is related to messenger gods and towards getting the message, right? And once you've realized, oh, I understand sorrow is a thing, all these things that I see are illusion, I've come to this state of indifference, I can move to a state of splendor, right? Anyway, perfume also is interesting to me, as perfume ordinarily in these esoteric texts refers to something along the lines of incense, right? You're going to burn perfumes, like burn to me perfumes, wear to me jewels. And when you burn perfume, the smoke rises straight up. So if you, in the absence of, something to disturb it. So if you look at burning perfume in Yesod, the essence of that perfume then drifts upward through the center of the tree, right, through Tiferath, where it maybe becomes smoke because it's no longer the solid. And then as it moves its way up to Kether, what's left is the essence of, or the molecules of the scent. So it goes from being more solid down here in Yesod to being less solid up in Kether. All right. Anyone have ideas so far? Thoughts? experiences,
I'm
tangents.
thinking of the incense rising up, kind of like carrying the aspirations of the magician and
Mhm.
to the holy guardian angel, to the divinity that lies above.
Exactly. Anybody else? It's okay to talk. I don't bite.
Well, I think also it just came to mind. I don't think it's maybe a direct reference, but the difference between perfume and incense to me is, you mentioned undisturbed, but it seems like perfume is what you smell in the absence of everything else. So I think perfume, as opposed to incense, fits really, really well with indifference, because
Mhm.
pretty much everything has to be gone. Idle thoughts.
And I would tag on to that and say, if you've ever walked into a department store and there are all those ladies who want to jump on you and spray you with perfume, it's like, I'm indifferent, go away, I don't want any of your perfumes. If that reference doesn't make any sense to you, I apologize. All right, so in the next section of the essay, Crowley talks about indifference as being a habit of normal mind. And remember, he also, sorry, not remember, it's actually on the slide. If you look a little further down, he talks about acquiring indifference as opposed to attaining indifference. And to me, that's a big distinction. I think, and I could be wrong, that what Crowley is implying here is that indifference is something that you acquire because you can work towards getting it. And it's something that you can go, like you can kind of go grab it, like you could acquire milk at the store. Whereas an attainment is something that happens at a much higher spiritual level that maybe requires some cooperation from the universe or a higher level of practice and dedication than merely acquiring, right? Like I don't attain milk. You, just like you don't acquire knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, we always talk about attaining knowledge and conversation. So sometimes I think he's just being a pain in the ass and splitting words, but here I feel like there's a difference between the two. I don't know if anybody feels differently, but if you do, feel free to chime in.
Oh, I've got a comment.
Yeah.
I only know this because of something in a video game, but an archaic use of the word habit is to describe a piece of clothing. So he might be also talking about something that you put on yourself, onto your personality.
Excellent. That's a great observation. Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Also the fact that he's talking about, he references the Tao here.
Mhm.
The Tao, that implies non-action.
Yeah.
As opposed to action. It is not the striving and the attainment. It is the letting go.
And how does that relate to indifference? Because you're right there.
Yeah, it is the non-attachment. It is the allowance of what is.
Absolutely. So as you might have guessed, my code for things I'm about to explain or that I dug up stuff on is that I highlighted Crowley's words in yellow. So here we go. Habits. I thought this was pretty cool. Habit comes from the Old Latin habere, to have or consist of, into the Latin habitus, which is an adjective, a condition or experience, to Old French. So when the Normans took over England, they brought us abbot or habit, because you know the British can't say an H in front of a word to save their lives. That led to habit in Middle English, and that's how we have the word habit. And the first, I just did a quick Google search for, give me a quote on habit. And the first thing that came up is this quote on the left attributed to Gandhi. Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. And the very next quote I found was basically the exact same words attributed to Lao Tzu. So I'm not sure if this means they both said it, one copied the other, or you just can't believe what you read on the internet these days. But I thought that was an interesting. Erasmus, another classical philosopher type, said a nail is driven out by another nail, right? If you want to displace a nail in something, you have to make it go out with another nail. But habit is overcome by habit. And if you are, go ahead.
Sorry, I think that's interesting what you're just. I was just listening to Sadhguru talk today about karma, and this actually resonates with his idea of what karma is, more of the true meaning of karma instead of what a lot of people perceive karma to be in the Western society sort of thing.
I agree. That's a great observation.
That's all I have.
That's plenty. If you are interested in the subject of habit, there are several very good books out on habit. In particular, there's one by a gent named Charles Duhigg, Duhigg, I think, called The Power of Habit. And if you are going to, if you're going to pursue the study of habits, he discusses not just what a habit is and sort of the psychology of habits and why it is that habits displace other habits. Like people who quit smoking often turn to chewing gum or sucking on toothpicks or something else to displace the habit of smoking until they can quit and then perhaps drop that habit. But the book also talks about how to develop your own habits, how to notice habits that you have and replace ones that you'd like to get rid of. So it's really interesting stuff. And he cites a bunch of other people's research. And I'll quit talking about habits now. So the Tao, briefly, just in case you are not familiar with the Tao, it's a Chinese word that has been translated many ways in English, some of them better than others. The most often I've seen is way, or the Tao. But it's also been translated as path or route or road, kind of like a way to get somewhere. But it's also been translated as a doctrine or, the principle, like there's only one, just follow that thing. And so in the context of East Asian philosophy and religions, the Tao is the natural of order of things. It's not something that you have to, how do I explain this? It's not something that you study and practice and get from a book. It's something that you get from actually doing and going along with everyday life. Like the universe has its own inherent order, and that is the Tao, is that order. And your job isn't to poke around and make your own way, but essentially to go with the flow, if that makes sense. Nick, if I botched that, feel free to tell me.
The Tao that can be described is not the Tao.
Awesome. So as you can see, our discussion on the previous slide if you compare to what Crowley is saying about indifference and the natural order of the universe and the Tao, they all kind of go together, in my least humble, I'm not a religion scholar, opinion. All right, so I didn't know what the hell a sororite was. I was like, is that related to sororities? Whatever. So I thought I'd go look it up and explain it because that's what I do. So a sororite is an argument that consists of propositions that are arranged so the predicate of one forms the subject of the next, and the conclusion unites the subject of the first proposition with the predicate of the last. So essentially, it's not exactly a circular argument because we're not assuming a premise, but if you take these together, you see existence is part of a continuum, so all parts of existence are the same, so you should react to each and everything with equal indifference. And that's just a description of how this argument is put together. Crowley likes to try to teach you lots of other things that aren't actually the subject matter of the essay. So here is a lesson in logic from your essay on indifference. And then this practical parallel I thought was interesting because if you, didn't quite understand, reacting to events with indifference, Crowley says, look, let's say somebody owes you $1,000, right? And you know they owe you $1,000. Or he uses pounds, whatever. So, but you know that there's a credit of $1,000 in your favor and somebody's going to pay you back the $1,000. So it doesn't matter if the payments are $5 or $500 because you know you're owed $1,000. And it doesn't matter how fast you're paid back or what amounts you're paid back in. You're not going to get excited about getting $500 versus getting $5 because eventually you're getting the full $1,000. So, this isn't like a big surprise or windfall or unusual thing. It's like, oh, of course you're paying me back money that you owe me, right? One thing I would like to point out is Crowley's use of the word factitious. I love the word factitious because it means the same thing as fictitious. Again, word nerd, you knew what you were getting when you signed up for this class, probably. Sorry.
I thought it would have meant the opposite of fictitious.
That's what I would have thought too, but it does not. That's why if you
why does he like factitious? Sorry, why does he like factitious or fictitious? That is confusing.
So I would say there are a couple things going on. One is that Crowley likes to show how clever he is when he writes. And he especially likes to show people reading his writing how clever he is when he's writing. But another is that imagine you're in an argument with somebody and they are trying to convince you that okay, the Democratic Party is running a child slavery ring out of a pizza store in New York. And they are convinced that this is absolute reality. And you're like, yeah, that's really factitious, right? That's a nice way to get out of an argument. Like, you're totally making stuff up. And I just told you that, but you don't know. But anyway, my suspicion is that he chose the word because it shows that he's got this large erudite vocabulary. And that's why he makes reference to so many different things in his writing as well. I mean, some of it is just that he expects that he's writing to an audience that is familiar with so many different topics, that has read the great canon of English literature, that has had to study Western civilization. And so he can name drop a philosopher or a book or a war or a king. And of course, you know who it is because, he's writing to this educated upper class. But also I think it's a good way to show off. I mean, you don't refer to, oh, well, that's just like Caesar's wife, if you don't expect that everybody who you're talking to knows what Caesar's wife is, or you're trying to make yourself seem smarter than they are. But again, your mileage may vary.
Isn't there an aspect of this too where, Crowley at one point writes that, you should actually seek out the upper classes
Absolutely.
in spreading the law of Thelema. So isn't he in some respect here also trying to impress a certain class of reader?
Yes,
And,
I think that's correct.
Almost recruitment, if you will, I think.
I have the vocabulary. May I have your money? All right. So in the next slide, when he talks about acquiring indifference, he says you don't have to have an experience of the trance of sorrow. Okay. But then he also mentions that, and I love how he always refers to this as the dead aeon of Osiris, like the past age that we've moved past. So why is it that the methods of the dead aeon of Osiris, not the results, not the god, not the occult, like he doesn't just throw all of occult philosophy out when the aeon of the crown and conquering child begins, but just the methods of the dead aeon of Osiris were in fact attended with no inconsiderable danger. Again, this is a little bit of a show off. He could have said the methods of the dead aeon of Osiris had considerable danger. But instead he said no inconsiderable danger. Well, what are those dangers? So some of you may recognize this slide from a prior lecture, but the aeon of Osiris, just to catch up, is dominated by the paternal principle and formula of the dying God, right? This is the believe in Jesus. He died and was born again to save you for your sins and assure you a place in heaven. So the aeon of Osiris was characterized by self-sacrifice and submission to that Father God, right? Repent and you will be saved. Crowley, in The Heart of the Master, described the aeon of Osiris as being the formula of Osiris, whose word is Iao, so that men worshipped man, thinking him subject to death, and his victory dependent on resurrection. Even so convinced they of the Son as slain and reborn with every day and every year. And you can think about the original rites of celebrating the solstice, which supposedly were due to the tragedy of the sun dying and the days getting shorter and colder and more horrible, at least in the Western European history. And then the sun being reborn in the spring with more things growing and with the day getting longer and the temperatures rising. In the Equinox of the Gods, Crowley also refers to the aeon of Osiris, the second aeon, as being of suffering and death. The spiritual strives to ignore the material. Christianity and all cognate religions worship death, glorify suffering, and deify corpses. And part of that is, spiritual progress was seen as something, or spiritual attainment was something that happened later, right? Think about being a peasant in the Middle Ages, which, if reincarnation exists, most of us were not kings or lords. We were serfs, and we led short, miserable existences. And the way that there were so many serfs and peasants that were dominated by a much smaller class of lords was in part because the lords had the money, but was in part because of the church in the Middle Ages, which taught that your suffering on earth will be rewarded when you die and go to heaven. And we no longer believe, or we here in the Aeon of Horus no longer believe that you have to wait to get spiritual attainment or wait to talk to God until after you've died, right? And we don't have to suffer here on earth. We recognize that everything is suffering, everything is sorrow, because none of this is real. Like, my experience in the meat suit may be a good time, but this isn't the ultimate reality. It's only what my limited body and perception can perceive right now. It's going to get bigger and realer. So the methods of the Aeon of Osiris were intended with no inconsiderable danger. And he specifically calls out belief in separateness from the universe, right? The universe and God and all those things are outside of me, and I, me, right here, am real, a thing, ego. And he said it had a mistake to be dependent on such a theory as that implied in the First Noble Truth in its outer aspects. The idea that the things outside of me in the idea that all things are suffering or are sorrowful, thinking that that doesn't somehow apply to me because I am not a part of this universe. I am me, I am ego, I am a real thing. My ego self is going to go meet God and sit at the feet of Osiris or Jesus, or, be reunited in the hall with my Viking comrades, or whatever it is, whatever religious system. I don't want to pick on Christianity because it's a theme throughout multiple religious traditions. So Crowley says instead that it's altogether better to adopt a purely intellectual attitude and anchor it into your neshama, into that animal self, into that yesod, that foundation, by just transcending your normal rational mind. Train it in a method of contradiction or equating of opposites. And if you look back to the little essay on sorrow, you'll see that Crowley talks about 3 ways to cancel the trance of sorrow, and these may provide some additional insight on those. But let's move back to today's essay. So one of the fun things about reading Crowley is he was just talking about the age of Osiris and all these things that are attendant to it and one of the dangers of it. And then he starts the next paragraph with it. So just to see where we ended up, we came from, it's interesting to note this method is independent of the experience of the trance of sorrow. We want to experience it. The method of the dead Aeon of Osiris, all these problems, question of separateness is problem, this is problem, that's problem, and then starts with it. So I think it's a danger of the methods of the dead Aeon of Osiris. It is apt, moreover, the dead Aeon of Osiris, to lead to several types of error to regard indifference as a state inferior to samadhi. In particular, one may think of it as passive, imperfect, or an interregnum. So what Crowley is saying here is that, or in my least humble opinion, your mileage may vary, and you are totally welcome to share that. Indifference isn't something that is less than, and it's not a state where you're just sitting and being neutral. Like, oh, people are throwing things at me, whatever. It's not a pause between action, right? So in terms of not being passive, Crowley's previously referred us to Liber Cordis Sancti Serpente to learn about what active or willed passivity is. Like, it is my choice to be non-reactive to these things. With regards to imperfect, you can look back at his comment about Blavatsky, right? Because Blavatsky said, oh, well, it's kind of tinged with disgust. That's kind of an imperfection. And Crowley's saying, no, indifference isn't passive, it's active. It's not imperfect, it's perfect. And it's not an interregnum, which is like literally it means between 2 monarchs. So there's, monarch number 1 dies, and the second monarch isn't quite old enough to get crowned yet. So they appoint, the monarch's mother to take care of things, and that's the interregnum, right? This interregnum isn't like a waiting period. It's not, I'm indifferent, and then something will happen and snap me out of it. Indifference, he's saying, is a state of peace with victory. indifference is a good thing that you are like actively cultivating, but it's associated with making progress, right? It's that piece of balance with the victory of attainment. Anyone? Yay, nay? Other way?
There's
Well-
this book called The Peaceful Warrior, where this man Dan Millman is being trained by a guy who calls himself Socrates, and Socrates once made this comment: your mind is like a pack of monkeys stung by a scorpion, and that, I'm guessing, that would be the opposite of indifference.
Yes, exactly. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, you said attainment there, and of course it triggered back to the earlier usage where you're saying this is not attainment. You know,
Good call.
you know, this is, so again, you know, it's considered as a state of peace with victory. So, you know, the state of peace itself is the victory.
And it's an active state. It's
Yeah.
not.
Exactly. It's, you know, it is not a victory that is attained. It is claimed.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes sense to me anyway. Anyone else have thoughts they'd like to share before we poke forward a little?
Yeah, in Liber CL, when he
Mhm.
talks about liberty, I feel like a lot of the things that he's expressing in there kind of mirror what he talks about with indifference. Is there perhaps maybe like a link between liberty and indifference?
I would say yes. And the reason that I would say yes is because hitting that state or acquiring that state that is indifference is freeing yourself or liberating yourself from constantly being reactive and allowing the things outside of you to control the status of your inner sort of peace of mind. And so to me, I would use something like balance or equanimity instead of, and equanimity specifically, like yoga teachers use it, like equanimous mind, balance of body, all at the same time. I would use something like that rather than the word indifference if I were writing this essay, because to me that equanimous mind, that very even-keeled non-reactiveness is what Crowley's describing, and that itself is freedom to it's control of yourself. It's freedom through self-discipline. I'm not explaining this well, but does that make sense, Joel?
Yeah, it does. It does.
What do you
make
think?
sense. Kind of like the line in between the yin and the yang.
Yeah.
Cool.
Other
All right.
thoughts?
No?
I've only got a tiny bit more. Joop, joop, joop. All right. The last thing, his conclusion, I thought this was very interesting, that he referred to indifference as not perfect until it has entered into full possession of at least one somatic trait, automatism. And I have always associated an automaton with like a non-thinking, non-feeling, robotic clone of a copy from a sci-fi movie. So I was fascinated by this idea that indifference needs to have an aspect of automatism, but even more curious is that automatism is connected with the idea of samadhi. So I thought I'd look up, what do? I go to the dictionary because predictable. The origin is Greek this time, not Latin, and it comes from automatos, acting of itself, and then goes to French and becomes automate or automates or automisme, and that is where automaton and automatism come from. So if you go back to the root of acting for itself or acting of itself, if I have a sense of indifference that has acquired the ability to act of itself, I've trained myself into that habit of indifference, I can see that makes more sense to me then as being related to that somatic state. because it's not something I have to consciously like pastor into being like, oh, stimulus, wait, not be reactive. Like, oh, got pistachio ice cream. Nope, don't be upset. Does that resonate with anybody, or? Okay. So those are kind of all my thoughts I had on this essay. I think of most of the topics, the idea of indifference, especially once I just started thinking about it in terms of balance, equanimity, maybe Libre, the book of the balance, and some of other things that Crowley has written about not being so subject to the whims and follies of external stimuli, but the magician training themselves to be in control of themselves. It made a lot more sense to me, and it seemed like there was a lot less picky nonsense to go through than there is with some of the other essays. So these are the works I consulted. This will be on YouTube eventually, and I'm happy to send you a copy of this if you'd like. And in closing, if you are not a member of Second Mott, we are glad that you joined us today. If it is your will, we would love a token donation of $5 to $10 to help us continue to make the world more thelemic. We're going to stop the recording in a moment. I'll hang around for more discussion, but thank you again for attending, and love is the law, love under will.